So let's get started. Yeah, in 1991, Kyrgyzstan gained its independence from the Soviet Union, and since then has been trying to form its new nation-state identity, but didn't manage to establish a new hegemonic discourse, a common-sense belief regarding the Soviet past, thus justify its new nation, its new status as an independent nation-state. How effective is the Kyrgyz state in forming new knowledge and subjectivities of its citizens? In my dissertation, I analyzed representations of Soviet socialism in post-Soviet history textbooks and in the life stories of history teachers in Kyrgyzstan. I analyzed first how the post-Soviet Kyrgyz state reconstructs its Soviet past on the level of official discourse, particularly school history textbooks, and second, how history teachers as professionals and private citizens relate to the official discourse when making sense of the Soviet past. Answers to these questions contribute to a better understanding of state and nation-building processes in post-Soviet Kyrgyzstan, both in terms of how official discourse is formed and how subjects and official discourse interact. This is crucial because defining the independent Kyrgyz state's relationship to the Soviet past is essential in forming its new hegemonic discourse, thus its new national state identity. My starting point of analysis was Laclau and Mou's discourse theory, which argues that official discourses seek to achieve hegemony among competing discourses, and by excluding alternatives, while they also stress that hegemony is never complete or total, meaning can never be fixed once and for all, hegemony is always precarious and ambiguous, for hegemonic discourse will inevitably be challenged by other meanings that always exist in the field of discursivity, also called as reservoir of discourses, that are in constant social struggles about definitions for society and identity. So let me first explain you why it's interesting to study this shift of socialist hegemonic discourse to the post-Soviet hegemonic discourse, and then I will explain why history textbooks and teachers. According to Yurchak, the late Soviet hegemonic discourse was ambivalent and paradoxical. This led to the situation in which, depending on the context, the Soviet system might reject a certain meaning, form, awareness, while another continue actively subscribing to a third and creatively interpret the fourth, and so on. So it's interesting to understand the shift of such ambivalent socialist hegemonic discourse into the post-Soviet one, and to see how post-Soviet citizens make sense of the past and present of the system change. And why Kyrgyzstan? The case of Kyrgyzstan offers an illuminating case for studying a shift of hegemonic discourse from the socialist one to post-socialist hegemonic discourse through history education and general secondary schools. Compared to other post-Soviet Central Asian republics, the educational reforms in Kyrgyzstan have been particularly radical. Since independence, they have been largely influenced by projects and activities of NGOs that aim to reform the general secondary education system according to liberal democracy, market economy, and human rights principles. Moreover, these reforms have been happening in a state which is economically poor, dependent on migrants' remittances and foreign aid, with a weak state capacity and fragmented political elite. All of these factors contributed to the occurrence of two revolutions in 2005 and 2010 in Kyrgyzstan that in turn resulted in more socio-economic and political turmoil in the country. At the same time, Kyrgyzstan has a largely multi-ethnic population and is a typical example of a state in which more general nation-building processes have been happening, like those in Central Asian states, in terms of overcoming the Soviet past. It has all the ambivalences related to the discourse of the nation and state that were formed in Soviet times and where state independence was received unexpectedly and without liberation movements. And views on the ideological discussions in the order of discourse of nation and state building in post-Soviet Kyrgyzstan are also ambivalent and oscillate mainly between seeing it as a Kyrgyz nationalist ideology, which can be summarized as, for example, Abashin says, quote, Kyrgyzstan is the land of the Kyrgyz and for the Kyrgyz, what ends. Or as the ideology of genealogical related Kyrgyz, which contradicts the first vision as it implies the Kyrgyz as divided into different tribes rather than one nation. And or as a being divided between Kyrgyz nationalist discourse and new internationalism, or Islam and Tengriism. The latter is claimed to be a part of Islamic belief and to the real authentic religion of the Kyrgyz. And so why history textbooks? Yeah? According to Kyrgyz, one can expect the mixing of diverse kinds of discourses in history textbooks and thus observe struggles over hegemony in a given society. Therefore, school history textbooks are an ideal source for studying both official discourse and the ambivalences and contradictions that emerge while fixing a hegemonic discourse among other competing discourses in the society. And why history teachers? History teachers inhabit a unique position as mediators between the state and society, as well as between official and individual perspectives. Whilst perceived by the Soviet state and themselves as state agents and basic ideologies of the Soviet system, they have become state agents and basic ideologies of post-Soviet Kyrgyzstan. Yet they have been also experiencing dramatically neoliberal reforms in the school system at the larger societal level and decrease of the Soviet middle class and basic mass intelligentsia status in the post-Soviet present, due to the problem with state funding of the education system. As a result, they might produce ambivalences and contradictions in their attitudes as well. So let me now discuss the main thesis of my dissertation, analysis of history textbooks. Yeah. So based on the analysis of history textbooks, first I argue that discourse about Soviet socialism in post-Soviet Kyrgyz history textbooks is ambivalent and contradictory, and there is not a hegemonic discourse about the Soviet past. I claim that the textbook discourse about the Soviet Union oscillates between two contradictory discourses that are based on descriptions of the Soviet Union as the embodiment of colonial and oppressive rule versus as the embodiment of nation-state building power and modernizing state. And there are three different ways of being ambivalent about Soviet socialism in the textbooks. First, they do it by arguing that the colonial or nation-building and modernizing characteristics of Soviet rule and of Russians were contingent on specific historical period. In other words, things were different in different times. For example, the Soviet Union is depicted as colonial and oppressive rule in the early and late periods of the Soviet Union. Russians, as the main agents of the Soviet Union, were depicted as colonial and oppressive also during the Russian Tsarist and provisional government's rules. Starting from 1924 to Perestroika period, the Soviet Union is mainly depicted as the nation-state building and modernizing rule of Kyrgyzstan. So the second way of being ambivalent is weighing advantages and disadvantages of the Soviet socialist experience of nation building and modernization of Kyrgyzstan. For example, textbook authors describe how during the Soviet period the agricultural sector received a significant amount of support for development and that village life became more comfortable and civilized. But they argue then that at the same time many villages, mostly inhabited by the Kyrgyz, did not have libraries, cultural centers, communication services, hospitals, etc. And health conditions of the villagers were poor. I argue these two ways of being ambivalent about the Soviet past in Kyrgyz history textbooks is in line with the discourse theory of Laclau and Mouffe that sees the meaning in the social world as always ambiguous, but eventually a hegemonic discourse will be created, though in an ambivalent way and temporarily. And the third way, or finally, the textbook authors present outright contradictory arguments about the Soviet Union's role for Kyrgyzstan with conflicting implications without any attempt to reconcile them. For example, the textbook author's model describes how many gifted intellectuals who took an active role in the development of Kyrgyz statehood, culture, language, and science were victim to Stalin's terror. This had negative impact on the nation and state-building processes in Kyrgyzstan, and in the words of Osmanov, a quote, showed Soviet rule in a negative light, the quote ends. But then he writes, the quote begins, "Nevertheless, the essence of Soviet society was not distorted by either mass terror or the Stalinist personality cult, and the working masses were able to advance unhindered along the Soviet highway of progressive development." Quote ends. Additionally, the textbook author's approach to the destruction of the traditional nomadic and tribal way of life is contradictory. For example, Osmanov, having argued how the settlement of the nomad Kyrgyz by the Soviet rule had impacted negatively on their traditional way of life, writes, a quote begins, "These measures, nevertheless, created preconditions for the growth of social consciousness and an economy and culture based on and compatible with contemporary civilization." So the third way of discussing Soviet socialism in history textbooks makes new and void any previous attempts of the textbook authors to fix any hegemonic meaning about the Soviet past in Kyrgyz history textbooks. This makes me go beyond the discourse theory of Laclau and Mao and argue that independent Kyrgyzstan can exist without a new hegemonic discourse about its Soviet past, at least in the history textbooks. At the same time, my second thesis, I argue that there is a hegemonic discourse of the Kyrgyz nation-state and their modernization in these history textbooks, which, however, is also ambivalent and contradictory. We can find proofs for it, uneven attempts by the textbook authors to argue that the Soviet Union as the embodiment of colonial and oppressive power, and as well as when they evaluated positively about the nation and state building and modernizing role of the Soviet Union in Kyrgyzstan. Moreover, we can see it even when textbooks approach the end of the Soviet period and the USSR is again portrayed as a colonial regime. The self in this discourse is exclusively the Kyrgyz people, as constituted during Soviet times, and who, according to the textbook's authors, is the owner of Kyrgyzstan. Specifically, the ownership disputes among Kyrgyz and others, such as Russians and Uzbeks, that triggered land seizures around Bishkek in 1989, and the Osh conflict in 1990 make an implicit claim that the Kyrgyz have moral right to their land. Furthermore, this moral right trumps Soviet rules and justifies fighting against Soviet rule. This hegemonic discourse, on the one hand, and the role of the Soviet Union in making possible the creation and the development of Kyrgyz nation and state, and their modernization, on the other hand, are the main sources of the ambivalences and outright contradictions in the textbook discourse on the Soviet past. So let me now turn to the discussion on the relationship between the textbook discourse and history teachers' attitudes toward the Soviet past. So overall 27 live story interviews with history teachers were analyzed, were gathered in the northern part of Kyrgyzstan, including the capital city Bishkek, and most of these interviewees were born between 1988 and 1968, and the remaining three were born in 1931, then the younger generation, or teachers that belong to the younger generation. Yeah? And there was the exception of the two youngest teachers. They all worked as school teachers during Soviet times. So there are 3 males and 24 females, and according to ethnic backgrounds, 13 are ethnic Kyrgyz, 11 are of Slavic nationality, Russian and Ukrainians. One is mixed Russian, Uzbek, and one is an Armenian, and another one is a Jew. And 12 of the interviewed teachers were born in urban places and 15 in rural areas. 18 of the interviewees were taken from history teachers who were working in Bishkek, and 9 interviewees were working in the northern urban and rural regions of Kyrgyzstan. And only 1 interview was taken from a male teacher who came from the south of Kyrgyzstan, but he was living and working in a village close to Bishkek at the time of the interview. So, on the relationship between the textbook discourse and history teachers' attitudes toward the Soviet past, I discerned 2 kinds of analysis of this problem. And the first one was to identify topical issues and categories about the Soviet past in the discursive practices of all history teachers interviewed for this project. And in this kind of analysis, I mainly focused on mapping the existing meanings about the Soviet past and comparing them with the textbook discourse on the Soviet Union. Let me discuss first the material that I analyzed with this method, and afterwards I will talk about the second method and the material that I analyzed with the second method. So, based on the analysis of all history teachers' discursive practices on the Soviet past, I argue one can observe 3 major types of opposing discourses about Soviet socialism. The first is socialism as a moral versus an immoral system. The second, socialism as a colonial system versus a modernizing state and savior. And the third, socialism as an inefficient system versus a great empire. Teachers argued critically about the Soviet Union when they spoke from their professional positioning politics, which for some meant being a loyal nationalist state agent, for others critically minded history teacher, and for some both. Some are able to do this successfully while others fail. For example, when interpreting the reasons of the collapse of the Soviet Union, they attempt to follow the arguments of the textbook, but then they might admit that they really don't understand why the Soviet Union collapsed. So, however, under the factor of their status laws or the laws of symbolic capital, most of them rejected, negotiated, criticized, or creatively interpreted the critical discourse about the Soviet Union, and thus produced positive images of the Soviet Union. Yeah? And the loss of status for my interviewees is felt on 2 levels. First, on the citizenship level, as they lost their status as a citizen of large and powerful state, or as an empire. Yeah? And the second, the loss of status as history teachers, those that once were associated with Soviet enlightenment, progressiveness, and modernization. Moreover, depending on ethnicity or life trajectory, different teachers argue differently about positive aspects of the Soviet Union. Thus, for non-Kyrgyz Russian-speaking teachers, the Soviet Union was moral order because there was no Kyrgyz nationalism, and the Soviet person was morally higher than individualist, egoistic, nationalist, like materialistic and nationalist, immoral post-Soviet person. And for the Kyrgyz teachers, the Soviet Union was a moral order because, unlike in the post-Soviet present, the Kyrgyz culture of respect of elders was observed, and in general people acted out of respect rather than based on law, unlike nowadays. Thus it was the Soviet Union which complied better with traditional norms and the logic of Kyrgyz teachers. So, based on this analysis, my third thesis is that the discursive practices of the teachers on the Soviet past, like the textbook discourse, are ambivalent and contradictory and reflects advantages and disadvantages. One finds that textbook discourse is at times accepted, but also challenged, negotiated, criticized, rejected, or creatively interpreted by the teachers. To which textbook discourse they refer, what kind of discursive practices about the Soviet Union they produce, depends on whether teachers are speaking from their professional positioning politics or under the factor of loss of symbolic capital in the post-Soviet present. And the second kind of analysis that I carried out was in-depth analysis of 3 teachers' life stories, and they were chosen the criteria to choose these 3 teachers' life stories was that they were different from each other, yeah, or like maximum different, like the degree of difference was maximum. Yeah. My fourth thesis on the basis of this analysis is that in-depth analysis of 3 life stories of history teachers demonstrated 3 different types of ambivalent relationship to the textbook discourse on the Soviet past. Although all of these teachers belong to the same Soviet generation, born in late 1950s and 1960s, their life stories represented different biographical experiences. This led to differences in the structure and in the sources of the ambivalent relationships to discourse on the Soviet past. So the first teacher, Larisa, a career-oriented woman, Russian by ethnicity, born in the capital of Soviet Kyrgyzstan, positioned herself as a critically thinking history teacher, thus referred to the critical textbook discourse about the Soviet Union. She argued that she had critical attitude towards the negative aspects of the Soviet Union, such as the war in Afghanistan, corruption, inequality, and immoral Soviet communist, and argued that the Soviet Union was a colonial empire. However, Larissa's explicitly argued positioning towards the Soviet past as a critically minded history teacher is ambivalent and contradictory. That is because she presented herself as an ambitious, highly professional, and a high achiever both in the Soviet past and in post-Soviet present. In the Soviet Union, she made a career in the National Museum in Bishkek. And in the post-Soviet present, she is actively involved in educational and museum projects funded by the international organizations such as UNESCO and Soros Foundation. Therefore, in order to justify her high status in the Soviet past, she, for example, argued about the Soviet dissidents referring to the Soviet discourse, which described them as losers, and those who, unlike her, were not well integrated in the Soviet system, and therefore they fought against the Soviet system. And the second teacher is Janarbek, and he was born in a remote village in the south of Kyrgyzstan. And his father and grandfather were Baymanabs. So they belong to pre-Soviet Kyrgyz political elite, yeah. And they also made career during the Soviet rule on the local village level. Janarbek's relationship to the textbook discourse on the Soviet past was of a Kyrgyz nationalist history teacher. Consequently, he mentioned how proud he is to teach the history of Kyrgyzstan, of independent Kyrgyzstan, that was not possible under the Soviet Union, and argued critically about its destructive role for the traditional culture of the Kyrgyz. Janarbek also argued that both his father and grandfather were persecuted by the Soviet power for their social background, or for being Baymanabs. However, despite he was 11 years old, when he lost his father, he argued that he did not experience any difficulties because the Soviet Union took good care of orphans. Moreover, he and his siblings received higher education, which he argued wouldn't be possible in the post-Soviet Kyrgyzstan. Thus, Janarbek's ambivalent accounts about the Soviet Union are conditioned on the one hand by his loyalty to the tradition, and on the other hand by being thankful to the Soviet Union for taking good care of him as an orphan. And moreover, he also revealed that he has experienced downward social mobility as a history teacher and experiencing humiliation in the society due to the collapse of the Soviet Union. He tried to reconcile his contradictory accounts about the Soviet past by saying if only someone like Lenin kept the Soviet Union by correcting mistakes of the Soviet system and introduced changes according to market economy, and people were taught to be more efficient, and every nation was given freedom to learn one's own national history and practice its religion, then it would be better than nowadays. And this version of the Soviet Union would be possible for Janabek because he understands that it was about being together, which in turn would allow post-Soviet republics to help each other and be better off. And the third teacher, Maral, was born in a provincial small town in Kyrgyzstan, and her parents made high-run careers in the party, and her grandfather belonged to the pre-Soviet Kyrgyz political elite in the region, who was dispossessed by the Soviet Union and exiled to northern Kazakhstan. So another Paiman. Maral said that her grandparents respected the Soviet system despite they were dispossessed as gulags, and everyone in the village would respect them because they would help poor people, and her grandfather was such an almighty person. Additionally, Maral and her father wanted to pursue a career in the party structures, as it would guarantee them high social status in the society. Based on these and other examples, I argue that Maral has appropriated the Soviet ideology superficially. She did the same with the textbook's discourse on the Soviet past. For example, she argued that the Soviet Union was a totalitarian system, as in textbooks. While this argument contradicted her story about the nice and abundant life in her childhood, she gave completely contradictory accounts, one after another, without any reconciliation. I argue that Maral appropriated both the Soviet ideology and post-Soviet ideological and professional discourses such as Kyrgyz nationalism or critical teacher as a critical thinking teacher superficially, and as a result produced superficial and less ambivalent discursive practices about the Soviet past. Instead, she was more concerned about telling about her violent life and high status of her family during socialism, and how she regained her high social status after better life of the transition period. Moreover, the fact that the father left his family for another woman is argued to be the most important event in her life, because it led to the status loss of the family and the missed chance to marry a man of even higher status. So, in conclusion, I argue that history teachers like history textbooks produce ambivalent and contradictory images of the Soviet past. Moreover, as my fifth thesis, I argue that they have appropriated the hegemonic discourse of the Kyrgyz nation-state and their modernization. That manifests in the support of the Kyrgyz state in referring ambivalently and in contradictory ways to the critical textbook discourse on the Soviet past, in feeling responsible for well-functioning of the Kyrgyz state by educating loyal and moral citizens, and in longing for Soviet modernity in the situation of post-Soviet demodernization. However, due to the factors of nostalgia and status loss, self-justification, or a particular way of appropriation of the official discourse, they introduce internal displacements to the hegemonic discourse, like in the case of the last Soviet generation that Yurchak discusses in his book. Everything was forever until it was no more, the last Soviet generation.
So this is an example of a very complex and truly interdisciplinary study that uses discourse analysis to analyze how history matters to construct post-Soviet nationalisms by looking at textbooks, and also how teachers mediate and communicate and negotiate in their teaching practices. So my response is basically based on what I heard today, but also on reading two of the articles that Damira kindly shared with me prior to the talk. Both of them were published last year in 2015 in Region and Central Asian Affairs journals. So I'm not familiar with the full dissertation manuscript which this presentation is built on. So some of my concerns may have been addressed by you elsewhere in your dissertation. With that in mind, I'd just like to share some of the comments that arose out of my reading and listening. So what struck me most when reading the articles and listening to your talk is this kind of displacement of class analysis from the idea of hegemonic discourse. So hegemonic discourse is a Gramscian idea of this class-based, it's a term that describes domination of a culturally diverse society by the ruling class who manipulate the culture so that the ruling class worldview becomes the dominant worldview, and it's imposed and accepted as a cultural norm. And so it's seen as a kind of a universally valid ideology that justifies the social, political, economic status quo, makes it look natural, inevitable, perpetual, beneficial for everyone, rather than an artificial social construct that only benefits the ruling class. So, so when you do talk about how there was a dramatic change, in social status and the neoliberal reform of the education, and this was also brought up really nicely in the previous talks, in the previous week's talk on the salary reform. Yet somehow I don't see this really being brought out in how you analyze this. And I guess when you talk about hegemonic, so you say independent Kyrgyzstan can exist without a hegemonic discourse.
On the Soviet past.
Yeah, so I'm just wondering, so who is who generates this discourse? So, it would be good to hear more about how these textbooks are written, what is the process of their writing, how are they adopted. So it doesn't seem like the Ministry of Education knows each day at this hour what every school child in Kyrgyzstan is studying at that moment, right? So it seems like there's a lot of room for interpretation and incorporating other materials, or actually the lack of materials. So there are not enough textbooks, there are not enough things to serve as handouts, for example, in class, to employ these new methods of teaching, the interactive, critical thinking kind of methods. So who creates this hegemonic discourse and how? What does this process of writing, publishing, utilizing textbook look like? But I mean, you do say that you observe teaching process, right? So, that part is quite interesting, but I guess the initial stage is also important. And then also your kind of puzzle is framed in terms of juxtaposition of this clashing view of Soviet Union as either colonial and oppressive power or nation state building and modernizing enterprise. And these two descriptions are, of course, not neutral within the discourse, but are hierarchically organized as a binary with a kind of this teleological subtext, right? That whatever in history brought about consolidation and strengthening of sovereign nation statehood is therefore considered progressive and positive and desirable. So I guess I'll stop here and let you respond, and also leave time for others to
first, Damira, please.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. I'm here Yes, yes, Gramsci, yes, like hegemonic discourse of Gramsci is not only about culture or like it includes a social class aspect of hegemonic discourse. Yeah. But why I use hegemonic discourse, this term, because first in relationship with discourse theory of Naval and Moore, and they base their theory on the basis of Gramscian idea of hegemonic discourse, yeah, like critique and going beyond Gramsci, yeah. And so the main idea they take from Gramsci is like saying that hegemonic discourse is a common sense belief, yeah, studying which beliefs or which ideas have become common sense. That's why. Yeah, and while analyzing history textbooks and history teachers' representations of the Soviet past, I had to deal with like the change of economic systems, yeah, from the socialist one to the post Soviet one, this neoliberal market economy. And while analyzing my history teachers, I tried to show the working of that factor. Yeah, and in my dissertation, I also include more discussion of that problem. But to be honest, it's a bit periphery to my analysis because it was not impossible to include also all this like social class or economic aspect of this hegemonic discourse. Yeah, because it was not like it was beyond my research question of my dissertation. And so who generates the textbooks? Yeah, the process and who creates the textbooks. I analyzed 3 authors' textbooks, and they are all. Yeah, they are all professors of history, like they have doctorates in history, and one of them works in at one university. He's the head of history department there, and another one he works at the education academy, and another one is also a teacher or something like that. So they are all quite related to the state, and how the textbooks are created. So. Kyrgyz history textbooks, they didn't exist in the beginning of the Soviet Union. They all started to appear after the 1995. Yeah, the first textbook was appeared in Kyrgyz language in 1996 by Imankulov, and then it was translated into Russian almost in 2000. Yeah, so like most of the textbooks, they appeared in 2000. And they were financed by international organizations like Soros Foundation or Asian Development Bank. And they also told me that in order to win the competition for funding of their textbooks, they had to adjust their textbooks according to their criteria, which were writing history textbooks according to democracy, so like human rights, and also write nice things about market economy. Yeah. And then minority rights. And then another factor to consider is that the quality, most of the history teachers, they complained about the quality of history textbooks because they are written with very, very difficult scientific language. And that's so because the textbook authors, they just copied and pasted from their doctoral dissertations and then produced it as a textbook. Yeah? So many terms didn't change, and teachers were complaining, how can I explain to a 9 or 10 years old child what is командно-административная система. And so this is how the textbooks appear, but at the same time textbook authors told me that when I interviewed them, that they have more freedom, unlike in the Soviet times, so they can write good sides and bad sides, yeah, of the Soviet Union, or advantages and disadvantages. like it was not imposed by the state. It was their so they were free to write what they think about the Soviet Union, what they believe about the Soviet Union. And one history teacher even told me in the beginning of our interview, you know, 80% of the Soviet Union was good and 20% of the Soviet Union was bad. Yeah? So and then we can have such contradictions and ambivalences in the textbooks.
Okay.
My name is Damira Umetbaeva. I'm presenting Bishkek Humanitarian University. Thank you, Damira. That was typical presentation at international conferences, which I attended. I'm practicing attending in the United States. It's just a typical presentation. Good, not bad. But my question, you just presented, you discussed the approach, yes? How the historical material was given. But what about content itself? What was the main change in presenting historical content within Soviet times than independent Kyrgyzstan?
My question is partly in continuation of Mohira's, some of her remarks, is who exercises, who wields power? I mean, whenever we talk about hegemony, hegemonic discourse, especially in the Marxian language, or post-Marxist, I wonder where power is. In Kyrgyzstan's case of post-Soviet history reinterpretation, is there any source of power or locus of power from which these reinterpretations are dictated, shaped, somehow? And as we started to discuss, you presented these different approaches, ambivalent approaches on with several textbooks. I was thinking, we didn't have Vietnam, otherwise everything would be settled. So is this vacuum that Sugarline and Suyarkulova decided also? So maybe there's just no power. There's no hegemony actually. There's no hegemonic discourse. And then that led me to kind of, I think, a very telling potential attention to three words that you used somewhat in a sequence: contradictory or contradictions of people in recollections, ambivalence, and reconciliation. These three seem to be three levels of lack of clarity or something. Where contradiction is, in a way, an unaware state of basically holding incompatible views, whereas ambivalence is being aware and being unable to resolve it. And reconciliation is where you come to terms. And that last one is probably something that we are lacking, and I'm again going back to whether there's any mechanism, any system that is working at reconciling what was the Soviet Union for us.
Yes, it's the hegemonic discourse of nation-state and modernization. And that's... okay, sorry.
Yeah, actually my question basically continues what you just said, because I really want to ask you maybe to elaborate, to clarify this opposition, ambivalent discourse and hegemonic discourse. Is it grounded in the Move and Laclau approach? Because to me, ambivalence is not necessarily opposed to hegemony. So I think that hegemonic discourse can be ambivalent and can be contradictory, because it seems from your analysis that these contradictions and ambivalence and some sort of side effect, or the lack of power, or the lack of hegemony, while I think there are so I don't understand why hegemonic discourse produced, even in Gramscian terms, by the ruling class, in the interest of the ruling class, cannot be ambivalent. Why ambivalence cannot be utilized by the ruling class? Because if we turn to some other studies of the same question, the perception of the Soviet class in Kyrgyzstan, for instance, Sally Cummings' study of the Lenin monument disposition from the central square to the backyard of the museum, so to say, she actually argues that ambivalence is the hegemonic. I mean, she doesn't use, I think, the same terminology, but she argues that it is exactly what it meant to replace the Lenin statue from not to destroy it, not to hide it, but to move from the most central location to the location which is close to the center, to somehow explicitly show this ambivalence to the Soviet past. Yes, we somehow depart from it, but at the same time we want to rely on the modernization sort of potential and modernization efforts, and she argued that Akayev basically and his regime saw themselves as successors of Lenin's modernization. So this ambivalence is actually his hegemonic discourse. So I don't know.
So I will abuse of my role today. I was, just because it has something to do with discourses, ambivalence and contradictory. So my question is a little bit provocative. What do we learn at the end when everything is ambivalent and contradictory? I mean, for me,
Signature question.
isn't there some kind of a way to control this ambivalence and contradictions? Do they depend on the period? Because we speak of post-independence as if it's 4 or 3 years, but now it's 25 years. I mean, it starts to be a very long period. So is there some kind of a distribution of different kind of discourses, be they hegemonic or not, in this period? You
If
see
I
what I mean?
observed if it changed, yeah, during the
And
20
if,
years.
let's say, in the early 1990s, that, I don't know, the Soviet Union was rather a colonial power and very bad one, and lately changed, or vice versa, just
Changed, yes, to reply to Agelin's question, yeah, what changed? First, I didn't analyze the pre-Soviet history textbooks, and I don't know what is written there. But I doubt that it's written that the Soviet Union was colonial and that we didn't modernize it enough. Yeah, and so I assume that in the change happened.
Then what did you
in the
analyze?
topic.
Just approach? Ideological side, just ideological
No,
side.
I presented what I have found and contradictory discourse.
On
And,
what material or cover or what?
I can give you my article and maybe you can read it afterwards. So, about Emir's and Georgi's question. So my first argument was that there is not a hegemonic discourse about the Soviet Union in the history textbooks. Yeah, and we should remember that history textbooks are a special type of media. Yeah, because in textbooks we can see mixture of different contradictory discourses that exist in the society, and sometimes they are reconciled, and sometimes they are not reconciled very well. Yeah, and then my second thesis is that, but there is a hegemonic discourse of Kyrgyz nation state and its modernization, and this is where the idea that Kyrgyz nation state and the modernization are hegemonic, or like it's a common sense, yeah, that we all believe that Kyrgyz nation should exist, and we all believe that it was good that the Soviet Union modernized us. It's good that we have schools, we have roads, we have all the infrastructure. So it is hegemonic. It's not argued. It's not disputed. Yeah. And that's where they take this source of power, or source of hegemonic discourse. And but since Kyrgyzstan have become independent country, and it should, like maybe the textbooks and sometimes politicians, they feel that they have to justify the independence of Kyrgyzstan. Yeah? If the Soviet Union didn't collapse, then Kyrgyzstan wouldn't become independent. And that's why they, but at the same time, the Soviet Union created independent Kyrgyzstan and modernized it to the extent that we have modernization in Kyrgyzstan. And yeah, and what what we learn if everything is, and like for example, I can tell you, yes, this, why I say that there's not a hegemonic discourse about the Soviet past, because we can see it in the third way of arguing about the Soviet past. Yeah? First, so like the first, second methods of arguing about the Soviet past, they're in line with the discourse theory of Lahore, which says that hegemonic discourse will be established but ambivalent and temporary. Yeah? So we see that, okay, maybe a hegemonic discourse of the Soviet Union as a nation building is established now in the textbook, but then it's argued that it is then it is argued that it is colonial power, and like these first two ways, they are in line with the discourse theory. Yeah, so there is hegemonic discourse, but it's not temporarily, and it's argued this or that way. But this third way of arguing about the Soviet Union, that when contradictory accounts are just mixed, yeah, so there's no reconciliation. For example, by saying that, for example, the resettlement or settlement of nomadic Kyrgyz was bad for Kyrgyz traditional culture, yeah, is then undervalued by another statement. Nevertheless, it led to the growth of Kyrgyz it led to the development of Kyrgyz culture according to the Western civilization, or like European civilization. And here I'm saying that the history textbooks authors they failed to argue or to argue for this or another discourse, like for the sake of this or another discourse about the Soviet past. Yeah? But the hegemonic discourse that exists in the history textbooks is that the Kyrgyz nation state and modernization, it's hegemonic, but it's also ambivalent and contradictory. Yeah? And that's why, that's why it's we have these ambivalences about the Soviet Union. There's ambivalent discourses about the Soviet Union. We can talk about it maybe afterwards, and with more examples. It's it's better. Yeah. And Svetlana, what we learn from ambivalence, yeah, and contradiction, and it's my favorite question. But what we learn, I think we can learn that. Most of the scholars have argued that post-Soviet Kyrgyzstan or post-Soviet Central Asian states, or even in other parts of the Soviet Union, these post-Soviet republics have tried to establish these nationalist discourses against the Soviet Union, or more critical discourse about the Soviet past. But my work demonstrates that it's not this or that. Yeah, that there are ambivalences. That the social world or the meaning is ambivalent. It's not clear-cut as other researchers have argued. Yeah? And the same about identities. That there's not much work done on the relationship between official discourse and and discourse practices of people, but my work contributes to that field, and I'm saying that we are not just Kyrgyz, or we are not just Russian or Uzbek, that we can be different, and that even maybe someone is Russian or Uzbek, he also has internalized this hegemonic discourse of Kyrgyz nation, and I think that's important to know. And what we learn, how it changed. I analyzed textbooks. The first textbooks, they were published in 1996, and I didn't see any difference between the textbooks that was published in 1996 and in 2000 and even later. For
And when
example,
you say textbooks, I'm sorry, is there just one textbook for history, for Kyrgyzstan history in Kyrgyz schools, or are there different textbooks according to different classes?
Yeah.
How many?
yeah, school children start learning history from the 5th grade, and in the 5th grade they study the whole history of Kyrgyzstan, starting from the ancient, like starting from this Saks and Usuni, yeah. And then they come to Chinggis Khan, they even mention
And they
Manas
keep studying it until which grade?
until 11th. But the Soviet period
6 years.
is covered in the 5th grade, in the 9th grade, and in the 11th grade. And for example, I can say on the basis of one textbook author's work, his work didn't change it at all. For example, he published one of his textbooks in 2001, and then 2012, and nothing changed. The same, just some pictures with him, yeah, like in front of the school, or just and he changed some words, but the idea, meaning is the same.
There are books in Kyrgyz and in Russian. Did you
Yes.
analyze the difference between them, or they are absolutely similar?
Because they are translated from they are all written in Kyrgyz and then they are translated in Russian, and there is no difference.
Okay, let us not monopolize. I think there was a question here.
Debate. So my question it relates to the way you started the discussion, like saying that Kyrgyzstan is a particularly interesting case because it is different from other Central Asian countries. So I was wondering if you could also make reference in your conclusions, right, to other countries, right, confirming like your introductory statement about them. And besides like kind of obvious differences, right, that everyone is aware of, like I'm more interested in particularly in how the gap between official discourses, right, which is sort of portrayed in these history textbooks, and in other forms of public discourses on the Soviet past, is different in these different countries, right? And so the bigger question is, how is studying this Soviet past through the discourses in history textbooks different from studying other forms of public discourses on the Soviet past, and what is it? What is it that we get from particularly focusing on the history textbooks as opposed to other parts?
Thank you very much. Very interesting research, and I think no one has done it before. It's very pilot, and it can be continued also. And I think my question is that you have selected in your sampling history teachers from northern part of Kyrgyzstan, right? And what about southern part? I guess you have one who moved to Chuy, right? Right. So in southern part of Kyrgyzstan, do you think your research results would be different if you have chosen history teachers from southern part of Kyrgyzstan also? Because we know that it joined Tsarist Russia after northern part, and it has some differences.
And I know that your PhD is finished, but if you're interested in exploring this further, how about the intermediary space of between looking at life stories and textbooks, the ways in which teachers teach those textbooks, right? So discourse analysis based on classroom observations of how the delivery of textbooks is done, and whether you see elements of teachers practicing what their ideologies are as you've described them in their pedagogical discourses.
What are their ideologies?
Well, you mentioned that you've ascribed to each of the folks that you did an in-depth analysis of, the third one being kind of a superficial analysis, one of them being nationalist. Do they manifest that as pedagogues in their classrooms?
Yes, I have, for example, read articles about history textbooks, representations of the Soviet past in Ukraine, and the similarities. So they are also ambivalent. Yeah, so they try, or they say that Ukraine, for example, was created before the Soviet Union, and they don't give credit to the Soviet Union for creation of Ukraine as a nation state in the current form. Yeah? But then the researchers have found that, but there are also ambivalences because sometimes they also enumerate positive aspects of the Soviet Union in terms of nation building processes and modernization. And yeah, teachers in Ukraine, they also were ambivalent. And they were also ambivalent, and they also referred to it more creatively, like in Kyrgyzstan. Yeah. But researchers didn't use these like theoretical frameworks as I did, yeah? Both in terms of analyzing the textbooks and teachers' relationship to the textbook discourse. And how different textbook discourse from other official discourse. Not that much.
No, not other official, but other
public.
Yeah, other public discourses. You know, textbook discourses, they, like as I said, they usually contain different kinds of discourses, sometimes contradictory ones, and that's why textbooks are interesting to study what kind of contradictory and what kind of competing discourses exist in the society. For example, in other social order or in other order of discourse, for example, one can see just one history author is talking about Soviet Union as only colonial power. I remember I listened to the interview of one textbook author, and he was giving interview when there was Independence Day, yeah, and he was saying, yes, we should be proud that as a 5 million people we have our nation, unlike those who are 20 million people but don't have, and that's because our nation, our fathers who were brave and fought against the Soviet Union. And then they mentioned how the Soviet Union was colonial. Yeah? But then the discourse is finished, but we don't see their ambivalences. But then, for example, if you look on Pятый Canal, yeah, you can see that Soviet Union, like they are making different kinds of movies or different kinds of stories about the Soviet Union. There they present the Soviet Union or mention the Soviet Union's role as a nation building and modernizing. But they are different mediums or like discourses that are existing in different spaces and time. Yeah? But in textbooks we can see all these competing and contradictory and discourses in one place, yeah? And that's why textbooks are ambivalent and contradictory. Elira, this house, yeah, unfortunately we didn't take interviews from the south. And I think the difference maybe would be different in the south, but when we interview maybe Uzbek teachers, because of this history, yeah, like interethnic conflict and the role of Uzbekistan, which is quite, or it has changed, of course, but yeah, like before Uzbekistan was more powerful than Kyrgyzstan for southern Uzbeks, yeah. But maybe there would be, yeah, they will give us different ideas about the Soviet Union and also about Kyrgyz nation. If they have internalized this hegemony of Kyrgyz nation. Yeah. And
although you will be ambivalent, contradictory as all the others.
Yeah, but it's interesting to see
the question of AUCA. And then the last one will be ours.
How delivery is done. Yeah, how delivery is done. Yes, that would be perfect if I would include class observation, but it was already, my research had 2 levels, yeah, textbook analysis, discourse analysis, and teachers' discourse practices. But teachers, like life stories, what is good about life stories, yeah, I'm an anthropologist and we usually do field works, and we don't like when people don't do field works. But I did, but it was not the main aspect of my PhD. So, but life stories can also give us good insights, yeah, that we might get from observations, yeah, class participation or from participant observation. Because in life stories, usually people tell also contradictory and ambivalent stories. Yeah, so they, you can see how they have been influenced by different ambivalent discourses in the society. Yeah, and while telling their life story, they reflect those different roles and different ideas and discourses. Yeah.
My question is actually in relation to the term ambivalent. How, because it has now been used quite a lot during the discussion as well, to describe the idea that there is basically no one way to describe the attitude towards Soviet Union. But I was wondering whether in these interviews that you did, whether there were some aspects that were usually seen as more positive than negative lights and some aspects which were usually seen as negative versus positive lights. So in this way, whether you can see that there were some tendencies within the interviews themselves to describe like personal life as positive or the political structure as negative, or something which would help us to not only end with ambivalence, but to kind of see more complex vision, which could then be as well described in more analytical terms.
In my articles and in my dissertation, you mean not just this argument that it's ambivalent, but more stories. Yes, I have it, but I have 300 pages of dissertation, and we wouldn't have enough time. Yeah? But yes, I can share with you my article, and we can also talk about it.